Nick's presentation is a resilient story of fire response and a unique collaboration between a permaculture elder, a firefighter, a land carer, and a land education centre that was threatened by fire over 6 weeks from every direction except the southeast. Dean Turner is an ag science permi land care conservationist, outdoor educator who has been designing a permi camp for youth and southeast community with his wife Annette for the last 25 years. John Champagne has been an active member of the permaculture movement for 30 years. He is the director of his business Brogo Permaculture Gardens and currently the chair of PermaFund. Chelsea Moseley is an Adelaide Hills local and a firefighter in two states turned permaculture outdoor educator. Please put your hands together for this panel today.
Great. Oh, thank you, Chelsea, very much. Look, I'd like to begin by giving you our spirit of place, where we come from, and we'll do it with bodies. So Dean and Chelsea, can you just get up? Chelsea, you're Sydney. Stand there. Dean, you're over there. Melbourne. And so I'm in the Bega Valley here. So the Australian coastline goes like that, far south coast of New South Wales. And in the Bega Valley we have Byamanga Mountain, and the Sacred Mountain, and Gulaga. And
down our way it's Mount Dunedin in Victoria, although I'm not always in Victoria.
And the water catchment of the Brogo River and the Bega River. Okay, so that's where we kind of come from. And what I'd like to do, I'll just give you an overall view of what we're going to cover in the next hour. I want to go over the history of bushfire in terms of permaculture's education toward it. Dean's going to show a short film and then go into the social aspects of what was achieved in Bermagui in regard to the recovery process, particularly in community. And then Moseley's going to do some practicals in terms of some of the hardcore stuff we really learnt in terms of keeping yourself really safe in fire. So both of us weren't affected directly by the fires that came screaming out of the Brogo wilderness on New Year's Eve, 1920. But given that, we ended up for 2 months surrounded by smoke. 3 fires surrounded our property, and we had no idea where that fire was. And those 2 months were traumatic. In a lot of cases, we just said, look, can this fire just come through, and we just want to get over it. We're sick of waiting. It was a really emotional state. And so that was where, Dean's work and that really kicked in terms of, accommodating what neighbours were experiencing from an emotional state. And it was interesting, after the episode, the Bega Valley Shire Council, Red Cross, and that were giving us funding to do workshops for people that were affected. And that was a good acknowledgement that, hey, permaculture may have something to offer people that have gone through this trauma. So that was satisfying. So we started doing these workshops, and it forced me to look at the history of permaculture thinking in the permaculture movement. And it really goes, Mollison was part of that massive fire that came in Tasmania, I think in the 1960s, and wrote about it in the Designer's Manual and publications. And then Ash Wednesday comes along in Victoria, South Australia, a massive fire event. And, obviously there was David Holmgren going over there, looking at why did that burn, why didn't that burn, and wrote that amazing book, The Flywire House, that was quite innovative at the time, and it was adopted by authorities later on. So, permaculture's been talking about fire all the time. We know it as part of our sector analysis when we identify those things that impact our land that we cannot control. The big one is disasters. And in our area, it's certainly things like fire, flooding, things like that. When you teach in Sumatra and you say, what are your disasters? They go tsunami, earthquakes and volcanism. And you go, oh boy. And it's not a case of, I'll plant some clumping bamboo there to stop the lava flow. It's not going to cut it. It's basically we meet here and we get out there. It's a community response. So yeah, we really looked at As designers, we know when we place our zones, I guess, in our systems, it's identified a lot by the sector analysis, and in our case, it was the northwest. We had our major fire in 1950, the last one was 1952, and the same circumstances happened in 1920. It began in the Brogo Wilderness, in Wadbilliga Wilderness area, and it burned for a long time, and it was just waiting for that northwesterly wind to kick up, and off it came. In 1952, the only thing that put it out was the ocean. It went around the back of Bega and it was put out by the ocean. And these same circumstances came out of that wilderness area onto areas that were cleared for subdivision, and a lot of people like us were in those areas, on those marginal edges up against the forest. And the ones that got impacted straight away, they were smashed. It was horrific. We're talking tunnel balls of fire. It was a drought. It was at the end of something like an 8-year-old drought. There was no grass left on the paddocks. Yet when you went there after the fires, everything was black. The whole landscape was just black. It burned that little bit, and that was because it was able to roll. I think they called it pyronucleus or something. They gave it a term, and it just rolled over paddocks until it hit the next house and went. It was frightening. So when we look at our zonage, we're always looking at putting our food gardens toward the north, to give it maximum sun. Say, look, it's okay to put your veggie gardens in that northwest. It's good to put your fruit trees on the northwest because you're going to water it. And I guess the key thing in terms of my place and what I was able to contribute to these workshops that Dean and I were doing is hydrology, is putting water into the soil in that fire sector. So at my place, I have, it's a very steep slope, and I've got a gutter on our main road above. So every time it rains on our main road, water collects from two directions with a diversion drain into an ephemeral pond. It's a pond that deliberately does not hold water, and it slowly sinks down. And that's my watering system to get my subtropicals and fruit trees growing, but it's, at the same time, it's hydrating the soil underneath and keeping that way. The more water you can store in the soil, the more potential those trees are able to take up that water and assist any possible mitigation of fire coming through that way. And then swale. So I have a driveway that goes down a hill toward the house, and I have 5 swales coming off that, a long contour right to my property boundary, and again they soak into the soil. So there's no irrigation system. I don't have water. My whole property relies on rainfall. So the use of earthworks, it's critical. Particularly, we understand that in permaculture, but at my place, my focus was the patterning of that machine to create the serpentine pattern for swales and get water into that soil. So whenever it rains, it goes to a critical point where it soaks in, and that's where I grow my trees to take the benefit of that water going down. And I guess the other one is the ember blockers. There's the two main reasons fires destroy houses is radiant heat and ember attack. And in terms of ember attack, we're looking at species of trees that will, be able to deflect embers that are flying at you at the rate of knots from going to your house. So the placement of, in my case, deciduous trees as an ember blocker is also critical for, assisting with that design. So right at the beginning, when we first arrived at our property, Sharon and I, 30 years ago, doing our original design, it was a case of not if a fire will come, it will come, and I need to put some elements in place that will assist me. They may not work, I don't know. The fire didn't impact us, so I don't know, but at least you've had a go. At least you've given it some thought, and your potential for succeeding is a lot better than if you do nothing. So I guess the hydrology story is really important. And historically, we see in the Australian landscape since colonisation, I guess hydrology is something that has diminished in terms of land clearing and hooved animals. We've totally dried out the continent. And, I think we're going to see more and more of these extreme fire conditions because of the poor management in terms of farming, in terms of, looking after our native forests, our wilderness areas. They're not well managed, and there needs to be serious consideration in terms of how we manage them into the future. So I'll just hand over to Dean now and go through the film.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that introduction and some of that history too. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, the crossing, the education centre that I run with my partner Annette, we're just over the hill from the Cobargo firestorm. So you can kind of get a bit of a sense of what was going on in our area. It was a pretty serious event. We got together roads during lockdown. COVID came fast on the heels of the fires, and we had an exemption because we were fire affected region. So we got roads together, road by road by road by road, to share. And this goes down to grief as well, to allow people to process, to allow people to share. I'll let them talk about what they got out of it. There's a short film. Yeah, so that so those gatherings formed the basis of a series of recommendations which led to the development of workshops. And those workshops we've been running ever since. So we have a grassroots community mandate for those workshops in our region. And the hope was that by getting together those who were preparing for the longest, that we could then use that knowledge to benefit those who lost everything and who didn't have time to be part of those gatherings, because they were worried about their immediate needs, the needs for shelter, the needs for immediate stuff. And that's exactly what's happening now. We went from probably 2 to 5% of our participants in the workshops being really directly fire affected. Now those percentages are up at the 40 to 45% mark and growing, as they've met their immediate needs and they're able to come and engage with us and benefit from then tapping into all this shared knowledge. So that's sort of been a great process for all of us. One of the other things that I want to do now is just move on to a quick slideshow about this whole process. There's 2 critical websites here. So if you've got a camera, you can photograph them and you can get a lot more information off the Facebook page and off the landscape page. And there's a lot of detail there that you'll be able to tap into and use and share with your networks. So I'm encouraging you to do that. Okay, we might just move on. I think I've got a controller somewhere even. That's not my car keys. Must be in the other pocket. Ah, here it is. Okay. For me, it all started in 2011 when my son was very concerned about a fire immediately near us that threatened us. And he was at that key age where these things could manifest long term as an issue. So he had a science project due, and together we decided it was a good idea to focus on burning all the green leaves he could find around us and discover what was more threatening and what wasn't. And this was a way to deal with that anxiety and turn it into something positive. For us, the Badja fire did arrive on New Year's Day 2020. This is my son at the fire front a few days later when it was safe to approach. And this was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We had 3 evacuations. We had 6 directions of fire threat and 1.5 months of fire preparation. So our region had a lot of time to work on this. This is us, the blue star, and you can see that things were pretty close. During the whole process, as permaculturists, we're always trying to find ways to be part of our community. And so one of the ways was to load up all the camp's mattresses and give our firefighters somewhere to put their heads down at night time. So that was an immediate thing we could do. We thought, oh, well, the camp's probably going to burn anyway, so we may as well go and do that. This was ember, worried about embers getting under verandas, so immediate way of dealing with that. It's an issue we hadn't thought of before, but it came to the fore as we started to look much more critically at our design and get more people involved and helping, more volunteers turning up to help. So yeah, that was the result. Locals got involved. A donation was given to us, a new fire trailer. We had a small one, but now we've got a big one. And yeah, locals getting involved to assist was fantastic. Burmi became a hub for the World Central Kitchen. They're in the Ukraine at the moment. They're wherever disasters strike in the world, amazing mob of people. And on this particular day, I took a photo. It turned out to be the host, Kelly. It was her birthday that day, and I've subsequently shown her this photo, and she's just blown away by what they were doing. But I worked out they were feeding 784 families on that particular day out of her little restaurant. And the distribution network work that they used has now changed her business forever. She's changed the whole way she does business, and she now does it all this way through a distribution network to families. Yeah, fascinating. This is Chelsea. Here he is. Chelsea was with us for a couple of years at the crossing. He's actually an Adelaide local, but he was over our way for a while. And in between getting on the truck, Chelsea was helping me help friends of the crossing who had lost stuff. And in this particular case, they'd lost their dunny. So we just whipped up a quick new dunny for them and took it over. And this was us replacing their main pipe because it was too shallow in the ground and it had bubbled and burst and gone. The fire was very intense. So a lot of metal tanks didn't survive the fire. That was very interesting. Really only cement survived the fire. We had 3 choppers for 3 days, and my wife Annette almost ended up in the bucket one time. 3 choppers came together, and so one of them jumped the electricity line and came down right in the swimming hole where we were cooling off after having been preparing all day, and yeah, she nearly went. It was pretty close. This is just over the ridge from us, just over the hill. It's in our eyesight, and this is a friend's place, and you can tell the radiant heat was so hot, it's melted the pipe on the side of the tank there. This was always a bare car park. It never had any fuel in it. So it's just radiant heat doing that.
It's worth noting. It's worth noting at this point that we'd had 70 mils of rain between the first bit of fire and the run that impacted this home. So we'd had significant rain and about 4 weeks between when the fire started, impacted Cobargo, threatened us, and then did this run directly to the north of the crossing. So conditions had changed, and it changed again in that summer.
Yeah. And I'd just like to recognise Chelsea's role in the Bermagui Fire Brigade. He started with them on New Year's Eve, and he brought some of his knowledge from South Australia to Bermagui and was immediately telling them to buy new things. And to the great recognition of his captain in Bermagui, he let Chelsea run with it, and he bought the things Chelsea suggested, and that brigade were therefore able to perform very well. So
the background there is that my CFS brigade here in the Adelaide Hills has an op shop and is well funded, so I played with some toys that the RFS hadn't touched, and then we received a lot of generous community donation. We had funds available, and so we were able to get new branches, new nozzles for some of our trucks, which significantly impacted how comfortable and how effective our firefighting was, particularly during weeks and weeks of mopping up, which is taking care of small smouldering logs where we needed the water to last, but we also needed to be able to keep doing it for 16-hour shifts.
yeah. So you can see there was many levels of response going on at the crossing and in our region. So our gatherings that we held led to a few different things. They led to us developing a publication of fire retardant plants that I've been working on since my son's project back in 2011. It's stuff I was very interested in, and I thought, gee, shivers, it's time I got this into the public domain. And I got some help from a fund that Cobargo set up, the Cobargo Community Bushfire Response?
Resilience Fund, I think it is.
Support? What's the word?
Resilience something.
Yeah, Resilience Fund, something like that. But they gave us tremendous support and wanted that to be available.
Recovery, it's on the slide.
Recovery, thank you. That's the word. These were the questions we asked. We used the World Cafe format. If you've ever seen the World Cafe format in use, it's a fantastic tool. What have you noticed in the community in the aftermath of the fires? This gave people that mental opportunity to download and to deal with grief and enabled them to enter a deeper level of discussion. Very, very important question to go put that first. We spent a lot of time working on these 3 powerful questions before we started these gatherings. What was your experience around the fire and your preparation? What worked for you and what didn't? This is critical information that needs to be shared and needs to be done. And finally, what do you need now to feel better about the coming fire season, and what can you offer? So that was the process that we used. And these are the results.
So I'm just going to speak to this.
Do you want to pull out
briefly.
your pack?
Yeah, so duffel bag here.
Let's look at, was it number one? Some of the stuff that is in your emergency bag, Chels.
Yeah, so we'll start with, better personal protection, and this also speaks to the emergency grab bag additions. Some things I don't specifically have in here today, but I just want to talk about them. So something that often people didn't think about is solutions for actually staying out of home in some comfort for periods of time. So sleeping solution. And then when we talk about personal protective equipment, I have the privilege of being a volunteer firefighter and having access to Australian standard firefighting PPE, personal protective equipment. But if you don't have access or you don't have the finances to go and buy it in the private market, a woolen jacket,
Wool is
woolen
essential.
socks, cotton mid-layer, woolen base layer, none of that will melt. And it might be hot to wear while you're being physically active, but when you're dealing with radiant heat, which we'll touch on when we start talking about retardant shelter belts and using them as a radiant heat barrier, radiant heat is what takes it out of you. And so to build on that, it's all well and good to have, oh, and I've got pants in here somewhere as well. These are actually fire-rated pants. It's all well and good to be dressed in woolen clothing. Most of us probably have non-synthetic clothing, but something that you may not have is radiant protection and respiratory protection. So to that end, a respirator, a full-face respirator specifically, is fantastic.
$60.
Yeah,
on the
$60.
internet, and I've been using it ever since for everything.
$800.
Anything with dust. Yeah.
And about $20. So this is what we were using. I've since been given this to trial by the CFS. It's great. It's not 10 times as good. And then finally, this is a fancy fire retardant holder for an ordinary P2 or N95 mask with a valve. You need to have a radiant heat option if you're using a valved mask because it will melt. The valve will melt. And then fire-rated goggles. So a couple of options to suit everything, but these, I've never actually used it against a wildfire, a bushfire, but with burn-offs and the like, we found it incredibly effective against smoke and effective against radiant heat as well.
If you can keep the heat off your face, I know a couple that saved their house with this. They were on either side of the house. They could not talk to each other except through their walkie-talkie. The smoke and noise was intense, but that enabled them to save their house. It was just that face mask.
Yeah. Something else that's definitely worth investing in, leather gloves that seal against your wrists. Not specifically these are firefighting gloves again, and they're quite expensive, but something that seals against your wrists is invaluable, or a solution. So you could have a woolen jacket that you've put Velcro on so it can tighten around your wrists. Then on top of that, we have a two-way radio. This two-way radio also has an FM radio, so you can listen to APC emergency broadcasts and communicate with your neighbours on the same handheld unit.
And it's waterproof.
And it's waterproof. And you might
It's
think,
awesome.
why does it need to be waterproof if it's a fire? There's a lot of water around fires going every which way, sometimes at high pressure. First aid kit, I've got a head torch, I've got a battery bank somewhere in here. Just take my word for it. Battery bank, charger for the phone and the head torch and the radio. And finally, something that I don't know if it's strictly on the list there, but I am anaphylactic. And so I have an EpiPen that lives in the kit. Thankfully, I'm anaphylactic to mammal meat, so it's unlikely to affect me unless I stuff up. And then I also have an inhaler. Less for me, as I'm not asthmatic, but we saw a lot of people with previously unrecognised acute respiratory issues during the fire, and often emergency services will be overwhelmed or inaccessible, and so having something like an asthma inhaler in your first aid kit, even if you've never had an asthma attack in your life, could save your life or that of someone around you.
And don't forget cash. Cash is king when all the power goes. And don't forget those really special things that maybe you'll never replace, that you might just want to pop in a little.
Yeah, so I have another kit, which I didn't bring with me because it's got the laptop, passport, cash. It's also got all the personal letters that I've chosen to hold on to, and a couple of significant photographs and things like that. And then it's also got a hard drive with photographs of every asset that's not easily transportable, but you'd want to prove loss of to an insurance company while insurance is an option. So that's a lot of my outdoor ed gear, which I'm not going to carry with me, but I want to be able to get it reimbursed. My workshop worth of tools, things around the home, maybe a camera that really I could get another camera, but it's a multiple $1,000 camera. So I want to get another good one, and I want to prove that the one I lost was what it was.
So this emergency bag, this is a result of the Community Brains Trust. And this is a social permaculture response to a natural disaster. So I just thought we'd share that little example with you all. We'll go on to discuss some of these other recommendations as we go through this. And I'll try and finish this part of the slideshow pretty soon. These are we renamed them, the Relationship Saver Matrix. This was a decision of the Brains Trust because it did actually save some relationships. Having discussed all this before and having a different matrix for when you've got other people with you that are not just in your immediate realm. So yes, using the fire rating, using the warnings you're getting, and you know what action you're going to take at what stage, and you've discussed it before, and you have a plan. Very, very important.
The moment that a trigger threshold is reached, the next step gets actioned. You practice that step, everyone knows what it is, and everyone independently, if you've got a communication breakdown, can hopefully see the trigger and respond in the same way, so you actually end up at the same point without communication.
Great point. Sprinklers. A lot of these are not that great. If they're under a veranda, the misters are quite good, but out wider, they were found to be deficient, and larger droplet sizes are required, or the wind just blows it away. So that's just something that came out of some of our research and feedback.
And just speaking very briefly to sprinklers, and any sort of fire prevention that doesn't involve an autonomous active defender, it's ridiculously expensive, prohibitively expensive and challenging to come up with a system that will keep a building, a dwelling safe without anyone there to monitor it.
Yeah.
Under the same conditions which a single individual could easily defend, because you can identify that the sprinklers have missed that little bit of embers there and save your entire house. So I'd say that there's a point at which a $40,000 sprinkler system like this is not worth it unless you have no other options around insurance.
And just looking at the piping, that's copper, it's expensive, but if you live in an area that gets frosts, you've got to remember to dump the water out of it through the frost time, okay? That's very important. Otherwise, you've got to explode all your pipes.
We say winter. That passive homes need active people, and it's very much the same when it comes to the elements around fire prevention as well.
And if you use galvanised pipe, you've got to have rust issues, and eventually you've got to clog up your sprinkler heads. So there's a few things to think about. These are some other innovative solutions that people found. Instant shut-offs for your downpipes and ways to load water up and close off your gutters and things. And they were all kind of useful little discoveries that people alerted us to. And that's the beauty of the Facebook page we've made sense. It's not a public page, it's a private page, but anyone can join it. You just got to answer the questions. They were very concerned about privacy when we started these gatherings. Everyone hated the media. There'd been too much media and they'd been overdosed. So we just had to make it private. And of course, once you've done that, you can never make them public. So there you go. It's really important to understand this, that most houses burn down when fire gets into the ceiling. Essentially, it gets through the gutter boards and into the ceiling that way, and that's how most houses are lost. So being able to fill your gutters is really critical. There are other ways to make your windows safe if you can't afford double glazing, which a lot of people can't. Fly wire. David Holmgren wrote about this earlier on, but there's now a marine grade stainless steel mesh you can get hold of, and that cuts the radiant heat down by 50%. This is a huge deal, and this can really make a tremendous difference to windows failing, and that's the other big one. So,
particularly double glazed windows that weren't specifically designed for fire.
Yeah.
Have gas expansion beyond what they're designed to hold and can blow out. And so this can be the difference between your windows blowing out and them not.
Yeah, good point, Chelsea. Metal shutters, obviously the ultra kind of way to go, but they're very, very costly. A lot of them rely on automatic opening and closing mechanisms, and they're bound to fail over time, those sort of things. These are the attack levels we have in New South Wales, and we're in, I think we're in 29 these days. 40 is often, and some people face, they're right in a fire zone and they have to spend a lot more money to make their house safe. This is a really good suggestion, came out of the whole thing, the red and the blue map. Where's your water? Where's your power? Where's your fuels? Where's your gas? This is instant. You can stick it on the gate, in a little tube on the gate, and that gives you a lot of, it gives people immediate information that they need if they're coming in.
This was designed for situations where neighbours ended up defending when we had very minimal fire activity and it was safe to do so, but residents were away. Or at times when RFS or CFS volunteers were rocking up to defend a property. The idea is it would give us situational awareness and we could be much more effective with our resources from the moment we hit the ground.
I'm going to race ahead because I'm a little bit behind time. So this is us preparing for cool burns at the crossing. It's another layer of defence. These are the sort of cool mosaic burns, a little bit like a cultural burn, but I would never claim to know what is needed in a cultural burn, because that is a lot deeper knowledge about triggers, environmental triggers and knowledge, and our Aboriginal neighbours and friends that we also work with at the crossing. They hold that deep knowledge, and we're actually also working with the Fire Sticks organisation to develop that knowledge with young people in our region. This is our fire history. We keep it on a map. The years we did different burns is recorded and where we did them, and we're trying for about an 8-year rotation in these key locations around us, around the development area. We also have a conservation area where we are determined to exclude fire permanently, and we are also working at other levels to enhance our gullies. And that leads me to the next slideshow, which is all about retardants and shelter belts. And so we'll go on to that. Might just take a moment to load up. Retardants, you might have remember one of the ladies said some plants don't burn. Well, actually every plant burns, every tree burns. It's got to burn eventually in a big fire. That's not what matters. What matters is radiant heat. And do they reduce radiant heat or not? And it's about the reduction of that heat. That's the critical thing. So let's talk about the role of shelter belts. This is where we began. This is the crossing seen from the Cobargo-Bermagui Road. We've got a lot of bush behind us, national park, coastal national park, and farmland in front of us that was over-cleared. And so we've been putting a lot of trees back on the rivers. We're up to about 20,000 with young people. And this is the evolution of those plantings, looking back to the road. And over time, it's really made a difference to connection between our two coastal national parks. And that's it more recently. This is looking at the crossing from overhead. We are working to make our place a lot safer through looking at this issue of retardants and different layers of action in our permaculture design. The big overwhelming thing is sea surface temperature. The ocean absorbs 90% of all heat. It drives the weather systems of the world, and we feel that as wind, and the winds are increasing. on our coast, we are at really rapid increase in temperature. Narooma has the fastest warming in Australia, and it's just above us because the southeast current, the one that Nemo swims in, is moving south rapidly, and we are experiencing climate change. This is a great tool, the windrose. You can get it from the Bureau of Meteorology. The big one for me was, where's the evidence locally? Let's look at the long-term weather data. Bega Station is one of the longest weather data stations in the country. The only one that beats it is the lighthouses, but they're off the coast and not so useful to us as designers and on the land. So Bega, it measures the weather at 9 a.m. and 3 rather, and the difference is astounding. From 50 years ago, it was calm 49% of the time at 9 a.m.
59.
59, and at 19% of the time at 3 p.m. Today, it's hardly ever calm at 3 p.m. And in the mornings, it's only calm half the time now to what it was. This is this cost me $100 to get this data from the BOM, and it's useful to see where your winds come from most of the time and their relative strengths. As a designer, you need that information. But this is shocking. This is something we have to design for. We have to design for increased wind. Have to design for disaster. If you have a solid barrier, you're going to get a lot of turbulence. Any wall will provide a lot of turbulence. What you want is a permeable barrier that can let wind through. And this is where trees come in, and the right sort of trees in the right sort of arrangements. You can increase your protection area hugely. At looking at this little curve here that gives you only 4 times the height of protection, you're basically looking at a conifer. That's the old windbreaks of the Western District. And gee whiz, if you put your shed more than 4 times the distance of your plantation away from the house, you lost your shed roof because you've just created a lot of turbulence out there. You might have planted the wrong sort of shelter belt, and they're pulling down, or they're falling down, a lot of those old shelter belts, and the new ones that we're planting now, we're aiming for 50% porosity, and that gives you 12 to 15 times the height protection out into the paddocks and beyond.
It's worth noting that that diagram is not to scale.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not just the wind, it's the sun. You need shade as well. And gee, isn't that interesting? Trees give both. This is the classic structure of a shelter belt that's sort of recommended by Landcare over many, many years. And this is the sort of wind pattern it produces. High pressure on the windward side, low pressure on this side, and shelter. Very interesting to see that triangular pattern that emerges from a straight line shelter belt. Also interesting to see the high wind areas at either end of the shelter belt. You've got to watch out for those in your design. But it's good to just see that and to understand what that result is. There's so many benefits from sheltering from wind. And these are all the functions of a shelter belt, as many as I could think of, and there might be more. But there's microclimate, soil moisture, carbon sequestration, erosion control, fire retardants if you plant the right species. Biodiversity, drought, you can have a reserve paddock for drought. Foddy yield, floral, high value timber. Your retirement fund can also be in there.
So one of the earlier slides, in fact this one here, shows your progression in the different species, the different heights of what you've planted for the shelter belt, and just quickly touching on that, and then the fire retardants and also the high value timber. I just want to run through this and then I'll walk it round and you can have a bit of a closer look. We've got some really high value timber species here. These are blackwood, Acacia longifolia. At the moment, that's about $32,000 for a cubic metre of fiddleback, which is about 2 trees at 15 years old. I don't know the numbers on silky oak, Acacia robusta, but it's also incredibly sought after as a timber. They're both fire retardant. They're both canopy species, although they have some different characteristics. We're having them closer to the centre of our shelter belt. Moving out, we've got some smaller, lower acacias, but they're also very quick growing. We've got something that was described to me as water bush, but I've got the Latin name here, which is also a mid-hired shrub. And then we've got some salt bush as our ground species.
So these are our local examples?
These are local examples. We've also got one variety of she oak and a variety of Banksia. Dean's put together a list, an exhaustive, well not exhaustive, but a very long list of species. These were some that I could easily source locally that are local to this area. So I'm going to bring these around now and let Dean keep talking.
So this is also just looking at that shelter belt from the side view, just to give you a bit of an idea of how the wind moves across it or through it if you design it correctly. These are the qualities of a fire retardant plant. CSIRO says they should have a high moisture content, a low surface area to volume. Oh, I say it that they should have large, fleshy, leathery leaves as round as possible, and they should, if they've also got some hairs on them, that's a bonus because that's likely to be silica, and silica doesn't burn either. So high salt content too. If they've got a bit of mineral in them, of course, they're going to be very good as have a retardant function. So there's a bit in which plant do I choose. This is a design that I worked up for us at the crossing. I've got saltbush, hopbush, pigface, native hemp, muttonwood, yellowwood, sandpaper fig, hickory wattle and currajong selected, and they're ones that I'm trialling actively and I think will do very well. There are other species in the lists that I provide. Thank you. I'm going a little bit over time. There's a model I made just to help people kind of get a picture of the ripping that you need to do. To cross rip allows the roots to go in 4 directions or more. Don't just do those straight line rips because you only get the roots running in 2 directions and it can be a disaster. The moisture that ripping adds is tremendous. It's absolutely huge. It makes a huge difference. And on a smaller scale, you can just do this with a mattock. You can do this with a rotary hoe, whatever you've got. But don't discount the importance of ripping. It's really critical to health of your plantations. There's an example on a family farm down in Torquay, near Torquay, and you'll see the results of some of these plantings over time. Don't forget water. John made the point. Nothing's going to perform well unless it's full of water. Native trees fill up in half the time that introduced trees fill up, and they use half the quantity of water. So if you can get some water into them just before the critical times, before the critical events, they will perform extremely well. This is our place. This is areas we've identified where we are racing the rainforests forwards. We're working in our gullies to plant more of the retardant species to make the rainforest stronger in those gullies and provide another layer of protection. So I just want to finish with layers of protection. You've got your cool burning layer, you've got your fire zone that you've identified where you might be animal grazing actively, you've got your shelter belts that you've identified where you can put in your retardant trees, you've got your ember mesh over your orchards. Instead of the plastic stuff, you've replaced it with metal, and it's another barrier. And there's the one attached to our house on the right. And you've got the stone and the succulents right up close. So there's a whole lot of layering that we can do as designers to make a retardant landscape. I hope that's been of some benefit.
Yeah, Dean. Yeah, so just going on, in terms of being designers, and we talked about the sector analysis, in places like we live where we're surrounded by either national parks, regrowth forests and stuff like that, in our sector analysis, the fire danger is the trump card. If you've got a choice of putting a road or a dam or something either there or there, choose your fire sector. And just add that one more element. We don't want to rely on one element. As many elements as you can put in that fire sector the past. And as a party mentioned, we all know the Mollesism of everything works both ways. And we understand the tragedy of the worst part of it. I guess thinking a little bit about the good part, these fires started in Queensland in about September, and a reporter asked the Prime Minister, why were you in Hawaii? I don't hold the hose. He turns up to Cobargo the day after New Year's Eve and runs into a fellow we know, Johnny Farrell, with his goats, who told him off. And then he tried to shake the hands of firemen. They wouldn't shake his hand. And I tell you, the Labor Party used that message. He's gone. Thanks for listening.
I think, yeah, so I think we've got 5 minutes for questions. I'll run round with this. If anyone, yeah.
Thank you so much for that incredible presentation with so much useful information that's so relevant to people everywhere, unfortunately, at the moment, but particularly locally here as well. I've just got quite a technical, specific question. You were talking about some of the issues with fire sprinkler systems, and I was just wondering if you had any comments on the water cannon systems instead of the on-roof. Just because we're doing a renovation at the moment and trying to put the best system in place. Where my property is, we're on a dead-end road in the middle of a stringy bark forest. Our plant is run, and we are looking at pumps that are remote activated, and then if that fails, heat activated, and have been told that the spray water cannons are better in terms of creating a wall of water.
Yeah, again, as I touched on before, it's really hard to have a system that will all but ensure, with a high probability of success, defend your property without active monitoring. So you've got those automatic triggers, you've got the temperature triggers, you've got the water cannon. From my experience and what I've seen, getting water out before the fire front hits, wetting down the environment, it's like watering those trees. That actually has a massive suppression effect. But then you're dealing with ember attack, and ember attack in high winds often negates the misting systems. There's a system set up by a IT professional who's also a CFS volunteer in Mylor, just down the road here. I forget exactly what it's called, but he uses a series of cameras and some coding to target the system's response. So trying to get a little bit more intelligent. A lot of sprinklers that, if you were delivering water to all of them, would be too many, and you'd run out of water too quickly, and the pump size would have to be too big. But he can target boundary layers, quadrants of the house and whatnot, and that can be retrofitted to existing systems or installed entirely. So I can get some more details for that as well later on.
Chelsea, can I get Chelsea to put that on our Facebook page, on the Badja Fire Roads Facebook page?
Can do.
Yeah, great. All right, so we'll get that up there.
I've got a silly question. If I'm watering my property, is that reducing the water pressure for where the fire is? I know if they've got their own truck, that's different, but if they're hooking into, the system under the road or whatever it's called, is that...
It's not a silly question at all. There's a fixed amount of supply that can be delivered from the government pumps or their gravity feed system. Depleting mains pressure is a significant issue. So I would say that if you were going to use mains water for irrigation, to do it in the lead up to and avoid using it immediately during a fire, because we do fill up our trucks from the main supply a lot of the time, and sometimes there's nothing in there. The other thing is, if you're relying on it for firefighting, you can't. So make sure you have your own standalone pressurised system.
And nothing beats uphill water as well.
Yeah.
So as a permaculturalist, always designing so there is some uphill water somewhere, or up in the air water, that you've just got gravity water, because anything can fail, and to have that is just money in the bank, really.
Yep, just over here.
Just a question about boulders. I've seen boulders used as fire retardant. I mean, one house I went to looked like Stonehenge. They just put so many boulders around the outside. They were not against the house, but they were in the radiation zone.
Yes, exactly. Anything that will reduce the radiant heat. And this was part of the strategy with the retardant shelter belts as well, is that they act as a way to reduce that radiant heat. So you can actually work behind them if you design them well enough and you pick your species carefully. They can really reduce what's coming at you in terms of that heat. And the solid barriers, they're very effective. Closer in, yeah, for sure. But if you put them too far out, of course, you can create all those turbulence effects.
Yeah.
So that's really important to understand that.
I'd also say that you could end up with some of the urban heat lensing effects where you've got solid faces that are reflecting radiant heat, and you may actually have some issues with that. Whereas obviously an organic barrier, a tree is going to transpire a lot, it's going to dump a lot of water into the air, it's not going to reflect the same way that a concrete or a stone wall is going to. And from my experience, like rock climbing around the Grampians, you can be in some of those boulder fields and it can be over 50 degrees and then 10 metres away is nice and cool. And that's just to do with microclimates. You know, we work with our north facing and our west facing walls for that reason.
We've got one last question, time for.
And we'll be just out in the foyer afterwards if anyone wants to come up.
Thank you. Just a comment. I just wanted to support. There are apparently going to be some more Indigenous rangers who might be delivering, hopefully, a bit more of the cultural burn skills and things like that. We need to train people up. I know it's pretty thin on the ground here in South Australia. Only recently been announced, but I live in an area that was affected by the Bangor fires, and we've got a whole extension now of a national park area has been expanded, and that's area that really burnt very severely and was pretty scary and took out quite a few houses. And if we could have just some more Indigenous rangers, lobby our politicians, please.
Yes, that's very important. You know, the management of country and traditional owners being on country is just so important to reactivate the knowledge base that's there. And we've got 3 young Aboriginal trainees at the crossing at the moment. We're working in that area, and we've been working with fire sticks. I'm actually the conservation representative to the Baimunga National Park Board, which is a handback board and of Aboriginal owners. And so it's been a real privilege to work at all those levels as a land care and permaculturalist, and to support that. And yes, it's happening, never fast enough, but it's happening. So it's very encouraging.
Wonderful. All right, huge round of applause. Thank you so much for that contribution.